the war with Russia?
Well, I think it was certainly under push from Washington and London that has led to the war continuing, because we know that there was a peace agreement on the table last April, which would have ended the conflict, which seemed to be acceptable to both Moscow and Kiev. But Boris Johnson in particular, and then aided by the US and probably elements of the European Union, basically told Ukraine to keep fighting. So in that sense, they have become, unfortunately, a prop, or the stage upon which the West is fighting its proxy war with Russia. And the longer it goes on, the more Ukrainians are fed into the meat grinder, the more destruction, the more territory ceded. It's an absolute catastrophe for Ukraine, and they are in it certainly at the behest of their so-called Western friends, who are no friends at all.
Yeah, you've mentioned about the Minsk agreement. We all know that it was absolutely, well, death letter on the table, because it was never completed. It was never effective in the eastern Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. That's one of the main results of this tragedy.
Well,
Ambassador Ford. Yeah, Claire, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, even after the war had started in April, that agreement was there, where in return for Ukrainian neutrality and non-NATO membership, Russia would withdraw to the pre-February, and there was a roadmap, if you like, for how the territories in the Donbass and that would be sorted, but that was given up.
Yeah, and I believe that this experience of Ukrainian tragedy, let's say, as well, and the Donbass tragedy as well, is something which is very significant for all Eastern Europeans, including, of course, Polish people. Ambassador Ford, UK and USA together evidently try to involve Poland and Baltic states into the Ukrainian conflict. We all know that British Army trains and teaches Ukrainian military forces, and also so-called volunteer battalions, including Nazi ones. Washington, London, unfortunately also Warsaw, sent tons of weapons and ammunition to Kiev. Do you think that such provocations could succeed and lead to the down of what we all scared the most, or to the World War III?
Well, it's clear that US and UK policies are failing, and indeed never stood a chance of succeeding. From the beginning, policymakers in London and Washington were dreaming, were taking their wishes for reality. But of course, they were never likely to pay the full price. It was always going to be the Ukrainians who were thrown into that meat grinder. And therefore, running a high-risk policy was not actually high risk for London or Washington. And indeed, in domestic political terms, the policy which had been pursued by the British government has, I'm very sorry to say, been very successful in terms of popularity, with total command of the media, and no opposition from the official opposition. The British government has been able to pursue what has been undoubtedly a very popular policy, uncontested. And this is a result of the collapse of the British left. The British left has moved now to the right. In terms of foreign policy, the extreme right, or what I call the extreme center, because the center has been the most hysterical in several dimensions. Not only foreign policy matters of not only Russophobia, but Covidophobia and Greenophobia and every other passing fancy where people can get hysterical. What was the British Peace Party has moved far to the right. It's worth remembering that just 10 years ago, 2013, the British Labour Party, in a vote in Parliament, prevented Britain bombing Syria. It was a very close call, and they needed some support from some brave conservative rebel MPs, but there was then a peace party in my country. Those days are long gone.
Claire in the
with the
European Parliament, a den of iniquity, but they shine the light of basic human solidarity whenever they can, and it's very, very welcome. Mick made a point there about the inevitability of wars sometimes, and sometimes that they're not inevitable. I was preparing for today's debate by reminding myself of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe's report into the 2010 election in Ukraine. In the 2010 election in Ukraine, they said of that election, which Yankovic won, the pro-Russian, anti-NATO president, that was described as an impressive display of democracy. An impressive display of democracy. The OSCE observers said it was a fully fair and very competitive election. And the reason I think it's important in a discussion like this that we remind ourselves of what happened in 2010 is because that leads us to what happened in 2014, when that victory, that impressive display of democracy, was overthrown militarily, violently, by neo-Nazis funded by America. That's now without dispute in relation to the leaked telephone conversations between the Ukraine and the US ambassador. It is clear that the US was behind that military violent overthrow of an elected government in 2010. Why? Because that government didn't want further links with NATO, didn't want to join NATO, wanted to retain their neutrality, and therefore, in terms of inevitability of this war, personally, I think it was inevitable after the coup of 2014, because several months thereafter, Ukraine announced that it was reaching out to NATO, and NATO, in its absolute stupidity, said, yes, we would welcome Ukraine. Is it any wonder then that Pope Francis has the courage last year to make the point that none of the European political leaders have had the balls and courage to make, and that is that Russia was provoked in relation to the invasion. The dog barking at the door, as Pope Francis said. When the dog keeps barking at the door, inevitably there is a response. Would the American government be happy if China announced tomorrow that it was sighting nuclear weapons in Mexico? All we need to do is look at history. The 61 Cuban Missile Crisis nearly brought us a nuclear war. Why? Because Russian missiles were going to be put on Cuba, 90 miles from America. America didn't like it. So why should Russia be prepared to accept its neighbour having NATO nuclear weapons within its territory? Quite frankly, Conrad, that's what, in my opinion, made the war inevitable. There was no way that Russia could allow its sovereignty to be so endangered. And it is horrible for a socialist like myself, who is completely and utterly anti-war, particularly anti-nuclear weapons, and the whole idea of military might. I hate it, because the only people that ever suffer are working class people. That's the ones who die in wars. We know that. We know that from experience. But I have to tell you, if I was Vladimir Putin in the similar situation, quite frankly, what else would you do but to invade to try and defend your sovereignty. So in many respects, I think this war has been made inevitable by the actions of NATO, led, of course, by the United States of America. And I have to say, Conrad, that I think they have miscalculated. I think they thought with the funding and arming of Ukraine and the imposition of absolute widespread sanctions, Russia would collapse. And what has happened is China, India, Brazil, Argentina, other countries across the planet have said, sorry, we don't want part of your imperialist expansion. We're no longer willing to nod to whatever America says. I think there's a reconfiguration of the world going on before our very eyes right now. I think the recent BRICS conference just last week there in Egypt indicated that I think almost a third of the global output is now going to be part of the BRICS organization and moving away from NATO and NATO-inspired economic cooperation. So, Conrad, I think there's a lot of things going on in the world. The most tragic thing is the loss of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian citizens. It is absolutely terrible. But if I was forced into a position of saying, would I have supported that invasion if I was a Russian citizen? I'm going to have to be honest and say yes, I would,
was going out of
because
power
I
in
think
America,
Russia's sovereignty is at
he
stake.
addressed the worry and concern about the build-up of what he described, probably the first time the term was used, but he described it as the military-industrial complex that the US were developing at an enormous rate, and at a rate that the entity was probably becoming more powerful than anybody was going to be able to control. Now, obviously, since then, we have seen a lot of military activity from the US. They have over 800 military bases worldwide. Since the Second World War, they drop more bombs every year than every other country put together. They have, there's a certain elite element in the US that has a business interest in promoting war. Now, with regard to the wars that the US promote, you will have noticed that there's none of them on their land. So they're not quite as mad a risk to them as, for example, the present war is to Europe. Now, sadly, the Europeans have walked into this with their eyes closed. They don't seem to have thought out the consequences. They haven't thought about where this could go. I mean, we only had a debate at Foreign Affairs Committee on the refunding of Ukraine, and pretty shocked to hear some of the debate that took place and how unreasonable so much of it still is. There's still, I mean, you have people still saying that it's good, we must keep pumping arms into Ukraine or Ukraine will lose the war. Now, they're saying that Ukraine has to get back all its territory. Ukraine has to get back Crimea. Well, now, Ukraine are not getting back Crimea without a nuclear war. And has Europe thought about the idea of a nuclear war on the European continent, of a nuclear war? It's like as if they're in denial that it could happen. You mentioned the buildup of troops on the Belarus border and in the Baltic states. They're playing with fire. Now, listen, if you ask me, do I think this is going to escalate into a larger conflict between Russia and the NATO states of Europe and America? My honest opinion is I don't think so. But at the same time, Europe is being totally ridiculous in its approach. It is taking the risk that it could happen. War starts sometimes without being intended. I studied the origins of the First World War in university, and we went through the source papers of what was going on for the months before the war started. And, you know, some people think, well, it was inevitable. Well, actually, it wasn't. Wars aren't necessarily inevitable, but they happen sometimes when you're not careful and you take risks. And risks were taken then, and we're taking them now. And we're putting an awful lot at risk. Now, the American economy, I'd say, is not really suffering from this war. It's working class Ukrainians and working class Russians that are doing the dying. We have politicians in Europe that are not prepared to fight or send their children to fight in the same war that they're promoting. And not only that, but we have a 17% increase in food price in Europe in the last 12 months that is linked to the war. We have European politicians making calls that are not in the interest of their citizens. They're certainly not in the interest of the Ukrainians, who are dying in large numbers. These people, sadly, we don't have, listen, I've been saying all my life that politics doesn't really attract intelligent people. And there's an awful lot of, a serious lack of strong leadership in Europe at the moment. Merkel wouldn't have liked our politics much, but she was tough, she was strong. I'm not so sure the war would have started if she was still in place. Scholz is weak. And we have a situation at the moment. I mean, there's no point in talking about the Brits. They're becoming almost a failed state. And we're in a situation where Macron probably looks like the strongest of the leaders of the main countries. God help us, because Macron is not impressive. And his speech, which I read from Monday to his ambassadors, is a little bit scary, right? So if he's the best of them, we have a big problem in Europe. And at the European institution level, von der Leyen has been a dangerous little individual. Borrell and Michel are just weak, but von der Leyen is actually a little bit dangerous. So we're at a time where leadership is in good leadership, strong leadership is in short supply, and we have politicians making decisions that actually don't impact on their lives very much, but are doing detrimental damage to many others. And as you said, putting a lot at risk. It's in difficult, terms right? Of when the non-aligned movement was started at the beginning of the 60s, it seemed like a real powerful opportunity to do things different. But it was quashed. And there hasn't really, it was quashed more by the Americans than by anybody else. They didn't want this to happen. And there hasn't really been a serious effort to get it back on track. But there's no doubt about it, the potential lies there for it. And you have countries like Brazil, you have African countries, Latin American countries in particular, who are eager to develop the idea. Now, you were talking earlier there about the BRICS summit last week. Now, I mean, would the BRICS entity lead towards that? It could play a role. Now, most people will probably just see the BRICS thing as that's the China camp, that's the Russia camp. But if you look at the countries that they're eager to bring in, they very much focused on economic unity rather than political unity in the selection of new countries. For example, bringing in Argentina, bringing in Ethiopia and Egypt. I mean, these countries have strong relationships with the Western powers. And and they were prepared to join the BRICS, and the BRICS were prepared to take them in. I suppose the big question is, can China be a sort of a neutral player, even though the fact that is becoming incredibly powerful? It will probably be the largest economy in the world within 10 years. And what will it be like when it's number one? Well, we don't know that yet because it hasn't happened, right? we like to think that China will not be aggressive, that they will not be expansionist. Traditionally, in their history, they haven't been expansionist, and you'd like to think that they won't be. But whether they can actually, despite being very powerful, whether they can play that role where they could actually help the non-aligned movement to grow is a challenge, right? But there's been an awful lot of damage done, in particular since the end of the Second World War. An awful lot of lives destroyed. Millions of people have been killed. Tens of millions have been displaced. Capitalism, as we know it, has kind of failed. And with the environmental challenges as well, the perpetual growth, which is at the core of capitalism, is not really sustainable if we want to save the planet. These endless wars are not sustainable if we want to save the planet. The military-industrial complex has a greater toll of emissions than aviation and shipping put together, but people don't talk about that. But all the destruction that has been imposed on different parts of the world through military activity isn't acceptable anymore, and it isn't good enough. And it does point to the fact that we have to actually start behaving in a more sensible fashion, and we have to stop letting any imperial power dictate like they have in the past. It won't be easy. It's hard to fight power and money, but we would like to think that where we've been heading for a number of years now is not good. Something has to give. We need something different. We need change. And we need governments to realign themselves, and they need to start prioritizing the interests of their citizens rather than perpetually prioritizing the interest of big business, because that hasn't been happening. I don't want to start talking about neoliberalism, but as Chomsky said, he described it as capitalism with the gloves off, where the interest of large business is prioritized 100% above those of the ordinary citizen. But the planet hasn't been going in a good direction for a while, and a non-aligned movement could be an incredibly positive force. But as I said, it's challenging to bring it about. But you know what? There's been a lot of challenging things in the past, and Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was started, and we should gather together like-minded countries now towards building a real non-aligned movement and get as many countries to join in time, because this is the way forward.
Can I just add to that, Conrad? Because I think Mick is right, but I suppose where I would differ is I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think there's a momentum behind that now, because too often those of us in Europe look at the situation from a sort of an Atlanticist lens of Western media coverage. But the reality is that the countries where most of the world's population live haven't taken sides in this war. They haven't bent the knee to Western propaganda. And it's those countries like, this war has been led by the military-industrial complex. We know that NATO is responsible for 3/4 of global arms expenditure every year. This is where the drive is coming from. But actually, neutrality is more important than ever before. Mick explained the situation nationally. But even inside Europe, let's look at that. Because there is a divide between what the governments say in the countries of Europe and how the people think. Because you made the point of the meetings in Ireland and the discussions around militarisation. One of the reasons why those discussions happen in Ireland is we're the only country which puts these issues to the people for a vote.
To pressure the decision makers into copping onto themselves and bringing some common sense to the equation.
Clara?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that the response of the European establishment and the US so far has been to say that their response is more arms, keep the war going and all the rest of it, and we'll help rebuild Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. Now, sadly, the price of that is going to be borne by the taxpayers of Europe, who are not going to buy it, quite frankly. And that's not because they don't have solidarity with the people of Ukraine, because you're totally right, they do. And they've shown that dramatically so by welcoming so many refugees, as they should. But I think, you know, for all the talk, this isn't standing with Ukraine, because they're not giving them grants, they're giving them loans, which are going to be bled out of whatever population remains inside Ukraine. So that is a bad vision, if you like, of the future. But sadly, out of that brutality, I think already we've seen so many people seeing through the propaganda. And I do think, as many of the panel have said, it's in the hearts and minds of people are not buying this. And that's the embryo, if you like, of my positivity, because I think we will see elections all across Europe. The people are sick of what's coming from the mainstream. There is a huge problem that there isn't a clear alternative there. And I think what comes out of that then is going to be pretty confused and all over the place. But our job, and where we should focus on, and all we can do, is focus and put pressure on our own governments not to play along and be hijacked and the hostages of the military industrial complex, which we're even seeing in Ireland now. So our job is very much to defend our neutrality. And I take great heart out of the fact that even in the conversation that we've had in Ireland, it's not a done deal. I think Peter's point earlier about the role of the media and how we all know the truth is the first casualty of war. But even in the Iraq war, you could put forward an anti-war position and not be demonized, despite all of the lies. In this war, it wasn't actually the first time, because Peter is right. It started with Syria, that if you tried to have a discussion at all, you were shut down. So most people actually, I think as we do. It's just they've been shut down and they're afraid to speak out. And that's one of the challenges that we have to come across. So I do think that talking to each other like we're doing now, using social media and all of these things are very important, because people certainly don't want their money going on guns and destruction when there's so much dire need out there, even in Europe, not to mind the rest of the world. But the other positivity, of course, is the one we touched on earlier about what's happening in the rest of the world, that they thought this war was going to end Russia and sort of rescue US dominance. It won't. It's actually going to accelerate the decline of US empire, which was already underway. And the alternative to that, we're beginning to see.